I had an opportunity to join the Harbor Commission, which is advisory to the City Council in Santa Barbara, like it is in most areas. Advisory commissions inform the City Council on various policy issues. And then I was lucky enough to be the chair of the commission when this job that I've been in for 16 years came about. And by the grace of God and the man who hired me, John Bridley, I ended up getting the job, and I've been there for 16 years. And it's been the most wonderful thing for me and my family. But just before I took that job, when I was still chasing the soft money, the Maritime Museum up there said, Mick, why don't you write a history of our commercial fisheries? And I thought, okay. I mean, you know, it's like, we'll pay you $10,000. Okay, oh my God, that's 4 months' rent. Sure, you know. And they wanted 10,000 words. And I'd like to think after writing 1,500 published stories that I'm fairly lean in my prose. Well, it ended up 75,000 words. And this was several directors before Greg Gorga, and there it sat. Okay, great, here's the manuscript, thanks Mick, here's your money. And it sat, gathering dust. And finally, any of you who know Greg or know the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum will know that he's taken it to a new level. He's taken it to a wonderful new level. And he came to me one day, several years ago, and said, Mick, what's this doing? We should make a book out of this thing, right? So I agreed. I said, you know, I thought most of the work had been done, which I was wrong. But anyway, I said, sure, let's do that. So then, going back a bit to the original manuscript, I thought, okay, once I agreed to the 10 grand, oh, 10 grand, 10 grand, then I'm in the shower and I'm thinking, shit, now what am I going to do? Right? I mean, the history of our commercial fisheries in Santa Barbara. So, in the shower, where most of my great epiphanies have happened, I'm just saying, I realized that if I just divide this into chapters, mini books, based on gear types, maybe I can get my mind around each one. Maybe I can look at the history of nets, and especially as it pertained to the Santa Barbara Channel and the Channel Islands. And I push all my research and interviews and this and that into that. I can complete that and move on to harpoons, and then move on to traps, and then move on to hook and line, and finally move on to diving. And that's what I did. The process really took about 3 years, and the editing and laying up and what have you took an extra year once we decided to make a book out of it. So that's how this book, Hooks to Harpoons, the story of Santa Barbara Channel Fisheries, is organized. And I think the thing I'm proudest of, in terms of just a donation, if you will, to the community, is that there are really only two industries in Santa Barbara. One is oil, and the other is fishing. If you discount tourism, which really doesn't have a point of production all the way up to, you know, traditionally a point of distribution, it's oil and fishing, and nobody had ever written about the commercial fishing industries. So I had that great pleasure. We rolled this out in 2013, where we sold about 800 copies. It piddles along, you know, gatherings like this, we sell 10 or 20 books. And I was at the Gold Coast Lady Anglers Club on Tuesday night, great group of women, and down in Thousand Oaks, and they were terrific. They bought a bunch of books, and actually I was there last year too, so I was honored that they had me back. And I'm super honored to be here with you folks now. So what I'm going to do, I've divided this into kind of two sections. My presentation, one, I'm going to read a few passages, not too many, but just I want to give you a flavor of each of these 5 chapters. Each one is about the evolution of this gear type. And actually, after I wrote the book, I'm learning more about it as I do presentations. I think somehow intuitively, it managed, I like to think, to capture the evolution of the people, the gear, the markets, the politics, the imaginative spirit. And so I've got a few passages to read, if you'll bear with me, and then I've got a PowerPoint slideshow that are reflective of some of the images in the book that have little stories that help sort of pull the thread together as well. Everybody good with that? Rock and roll here? Okay, so the first passage is from the net chapter. I'm trying to find a track light to stand under, as long as I'm mic'd up, right? This first passage is from the net chapter, and this is about how the shark liver phenomenon during World War II made some people really rich. This is about why the Casagnolas own most of the east side of Santa Barbara. Okay? This is talking about deep diving gill nets for soup fin shark. Okay? And it says, overall, the nets were deadly efficient. Quote, profits were amazing, said Sonny Castagnola. In a very short time, we went from harvesting sharks for their meat at $40 per ton to just cutting out their livers for $10 to $14 a pound. During a good trip in 1942, he notes, he filled 50 5-gallon cans of liver, each weighing 40 pounds. That's 2,000 pounds at $10 per pound, more than enough to buy a house at the time. So that's a house a week, so we can do the math, right? I mean, if we all made those kind of wages, we'd be in great shape. But this chapter also discusses the use of other kinds of nets. And I'm going to show you a few slides here. Different types of gill nets, drift gill nets, set gill nets, per se nets, and trawls in particular. And here's a passage. Trawls basically are nets that they drag through the mid-water column, or more close to the bottom is more common historically for ground fish. And I have a passage here that I wanted to read to you about a man named Ralph Hazard. Anybody know the name Ralph Hazard? Well, you'll see a slide of him. He was the toughest fisherman who ever fished out of Santa Barbara and had about the kindest heart as well. As rockfish trawling began its rise to prominence in Santa Barbara, names like Ralph Hazard became synonymous with mighty hauls. Bobby Reed remembered fishing with Ralph Hazard. We'd tow for a couple of hours right out in the middle of the channel on the west end of a bank called the Finger. When we hauled up our gear, the bag would be so full it would pull the boat backwards. Then all of a sudden you'd see it, the Pink Mountain. 30,000-pound bag of fish so full you couldn't stuff another rock cod in it. It was an incredible sight. Ralph was a notoriously tough fisherman, maybe the toughest Santa Barbara's ever seen, said Reed. He was immune to the pain of cuts, bruises, hard work, or exhaustion. Quote, even in his 60s, recalled Reed, Ralph could outwork any young man. I don't know where he got the energy either. Hell, all he'd bring for us to eat was white Weber's bread, Swiss cheese, liver sausage, and chili con carne. But he could stay awake and fish hard for 3 straight days if he had to. You'll see a bigger picture of Ralph on the screen, but he was a sight to behold, and his work ethic is absolutely legendary in Santa Barbara. I've seen kids a third his age crawl off the deck under the hoist and say, I quit, I don't care if you pay me or not, I can't do this anymore. And he's there shoveling shrimp and rock cod from the bottom of a hole. He was a tough, tough guy and a sweetheart of a human being. So, the trap fishery in Santa Barbara, there are 2 species typically targeted in the trap fishery. The most famous, of course, are lobsters. Lobster fishing in Santa Barbara goes back a century, from the farmers hitting it with pitchforks and eelgrass all the way to the development of the modern trap. Started with old wooden lath traps like they have back east, but very, very difficult to use. You have to soak them for a couple weeks so the water pressure bubbles out the air, curing them, so to speak. But in the 1950s, a few fishermen, Billy Ming, Rennie Yater, yes, Rennie Yater, surfboard Yater. It might come as a surprise to some people that Yater's actually more famous for pioneering the Santa Barbara lobster fishery than he is, and being a big wave rider in Hawaii, than he is for his surfboards. And they developed the wire mesh traps. But long before that, in the beginning of the century, there was this wonderful story of the island lobster camps where men would set up Frenchie's Cove. Who knows about Frenchie's Cove? Anybody ever been to Frenchie's Cove? And do we know who that's named after? That's named after Frenchie Ledoux, who was one of these island lobster camp individuals. And unfortunately, the National Park Service tore down the shack. We won't get into that, even if I am on record with the mic. I'm just going to let that pass. You can probably figure out where I'm on that one. So lobster camps. Those clusters of small canvas and wood-carved shanties and their cooking and fish handling facilities flourished at Anacapa and Santa Cruz Islands from 1900 to 1940. They were unique both for their isolation and the breed of fishermen they attracted, men drawn to a solitary, survivalist lifestyle. Quote, some went because they knew they had an uncontrollable thirst for alcohol or an uncontrollable temper. Some were undoubtedly hiding from a criminal past. Some tried to hide from themselves in some terrible mistake of earlier life. Some, really the best of them, were the last of the old sailing ship men who had outlived their occupation. These men, mostly single or widow, remind us of the fact that the Wild West, the Gold Rush, and the Mountain Man era had expired but a few decades earlier. But unlike the Mountain Men, there was no end game for most of this tough and sometimes lawless crowd. No dream of stockpiling earnings or striking it rich and settling down. Most died in their boats or in their bunks, victims of everything from gangrenous fishing-related wounds to landslides, alcohol abuse, or gunshot wounds. Some were brought to the mainland for their final days, or in some cases, their final moments. No matter how crude, competitive, ill-spirited, or downright combative they may have been, the island camp lobstermen were part of a tight fraternal order. Christian Charlie Gunderson, Shorty Larson, Big Jerry Shively, Axel Big Swede Swanson, Frank Wild Horse Hansen, William Dutch Schultz, Kangaroo Fred Haggins, Little Danny, Honest Ben, and Hard-Working Tom were but a few of the men who helped color the era. And as sure as the lobster was the campers' target catch, whiskey and pistols were their social currency. So what they would do is they would work at the behest of the buyers on the coast, Larco Brothers and the Castagnolas, who would fit them out with their lobster gear, with their receivers, with their whiskey and pistols and boats and everything they needed to fish for a season, and leave them out there. And they'd come every so often, and they'd pick up the lobsters. And so essentially this survivalist bunch of folks, these isolated folks, were indentured to the fish processors on shore. It was actually a relationship of mutual benefit, because anytime they did come to shore, they just rose hell. They'd be shooting people, and people would be shooting them, and knives were flying, and it was just crazy. So they lived on the islands, their little penitentiary out there, and the buyers would come out there and give them their supplies for a season, and pick up the lobsters, 4 or 5 times a year. So harpooning. Anybody here familiar with the harpooning that goes on around here? You must be a swordfish harpooner? All right. Have you read this book?
My grandfather is.
Your grandfather's a harpooner?
My father, my grandfather, myself.
Wow. What's your name?
Danny Lazarich.
Danny, oh, of course.
Vincent Lazarich is mentioned in the book, and I'm related to the Castagnolas.
There you go. Congratulations. I honor you. So this won't be a surprising passage for you at all. So this is the beginning of the harpoon chapter. Harpoons, hunting or fishing. Among fishermen there endures a debate about harpooning, especially harpooning swordfish or basking sharks, whose size can range from several hundred pounds to several tons, respectively. Or is it fishing or hunting? Or is it a hybrid that marries the stealth, cunning, and patience of the hunt with the timeless challenge of wresting fish from the sea? Harpooning has been called a disease, so named for the fever it visits upon its victim, who grows possessed with the pursuit and capture of his prey. Consider, for example, this passage from a 19th century historian describing restless nights of a swordfish harpooner, quote, "He would fish all night in his dreams. Many times he bruised his hands and rubbed skin off his knuckles by striking them against the ceiling of his bunk when raising his arms to thrust the harpoon into a visionary monster swordfish." Now, you and I, and maybe Tim or somebody else here, a few of us have done this. It is truly, probably, how do I put this gracefully? Maybe the second best experience on the planet that I've ever had. It is something to behold. And here's a passage on what it can be like on the end of the plank. And you've all seen the swordfish planks right on the end of the boats, which they lower down to harpoon swordfish. Well, you'll probably see one in the slides here. It's basically a lattice work of, used to be steel tubing, now most of them are aluminum tubing, that lowers down to about 8 feet over the water, usually, depending on the size of the boat, 25 to 32 feet long. And when you see a swordfish from the crow's nest, one guy's the wheelman and he runs the fish, and the other guy's the harpooner, and he goes out to the very end of the plank with a harpoon, and it's just like Moby Dick, he's really just thrusting a dart into the animal, and then it takes out about 600 feet of manila line. Gets very heavy, the manila line. And typically, if they're well stuck, they'll die, and you hand line them in, bring them aboard on block and tackle. Well, life was equally risky on the plank, especially if a fish went berserk after being harpooned. Fishermen recall getting tangled up in a harpoon line as it sizzled seaward. One man broke his finger that way, then taped it into position to hold the harpoon so he could keep fishing. Vince Masetta, who many credit with building the first swordfish planks in our region, and he started with telephone poles and planed them down, so you can imagine how heavy those were. And if you went through a swell, they hadn't figured out how to raise and lower them at that point. If you went through a swell and snapped it off, you'd have basically a wild telephone pole hanging from the rigging as you're going. But anyway, on. Vince Masetta had a line burn his neck bloody as fish raced toward the bottom. Another man saw harpoon line spiraling skyward from a basket on the bow before going over, like a snake leaving a charmer's basket. Quote, they could take out 650 feet of line faster than you could run 25 feet, he said. Occasionally a fish would jump up after it was quote-unquote stuck and ram its hull through the floor pipes of the pulpit, that's the part you're standing on at the end of the plank, or charge the boat itself. One punched its bill clean through a fuel tank. Another struck its bill so hard through the hull that it could be sawed off on both sides of the boat, leaving a watertight plug that needed no further repair. Then there was the swordfish that ran its beak through a 6-inch thick oak barrel, and the one whose bill pierced the hull and emerged next to the boat's commode, serving as a de facto toilet paper roll holder. The skipper left it there. In fact, he honored the fish by varnishing the bill every year. You know, I've done this, I've seen this, and it's actually a little scary, but that's why on the end of the pulpit, you would always, a lot of skippers, most of them would always have a knife. In case you got tangled up in that line, you could free yourself, because those swordfish, they didn't like being, some of them would just lay there and go to the bottom and die, and some of them, especially if you just pissed them off and didn't get the dart in really good, would go absolutely bananas. So hook and line, the rock cod fishery. Now I know there's a man in this room who's probably the best rock cod fisherman I've ever known, or will ever name his name because it'll just embarrass him. But rock cod fishing is, hook and line is that method by which you drop hooks down on rocky reefs and hard bottom with different kinds of bait, and the rock cod, you know, the bocaccio, the vermilions, the cow cod, the chili pepper rockfish, they grab on and you haul them up. Well, in the modern day, you can sit on your couch and you can look at the bathymetry of the ocean, drinking a coldie, and figure out where you want to go fishing next, right? Didn't always start that way. Former Santa Barbara fisherman Red Allen recalled hand-lining rockfish aboard a 36-footer with his father, Vince Coolgis, after his family moved from Avila Beach to Santa Barbara in 1935. At the time, 7 rock cotters hailed from Santa Barbara. Quote, we had no fathometer back then, so we'd motor along, dragging a weight until he hit a rock pile and got stuck. Then we'd start fishing. Usually we caught red rock cod and could fill the boat with 2.5 tons in a day or two, weather permitting. We rarely caught less than a ton a day, even though we only took enough ice for a few days, and even though the weather blew a gale up there, and I think he's talking about the Conception or Guello area, I'm sure he is. I can't remember ever coming home skunked. So these guys had no radar, no fathometer, all the time and compass stuff, right? They might leave a buoy out there if they found a good spot and wanted to find it and come back to it the next day. They didn't have anything remotely close to the electronics on a modern-day fishing boat or modern-day motorboat of any, power boat of any kind. Dating myself, when I started fishing, commercial fishing and running sport boats, the big breakthrough was Loran A. That was like the huge deal. Wow, we got a thing where we can, the mechanic would click, 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 dial this thing in, and you had to dial it in so these sine waves lined up, and then you got one leg of a triangulated radio signal. It's complicated, as a slave station and a repeater and all that. And then you switch it to another one and you line those up, you could actually figure out where you were. What a concept, right? And that was a huge deal. But to be honest with you, I've never found anything more accurate than landmarks. So tight, much more tight than GPS, much tighter than GPS. Landmarks to the point where, like, I'm looking out there right now and I'm looking at one of these support pillars here on this building, and I'm going to take one step, And that tree that it lined up with, in the back of it, you know, third of a mile away, just completely moved. That much, right? So if you got a landmark was that tight, there's nothing, no kind of navigation that can get you any better back on the spot. And that's what we lived by, you know, when I was fishing the boats up here and what have you, or time and compass and that kind of stuff. But the advances have been considerable. In fact, before people started using hydraulics to haul rock cod lines, and I was lucky to be in on the early edge of that, but I had a really crude setup, which you'll hear about here in a second. But in the 50s and 60s and 70s, before the application of hydraulics to the fishing industry really took hold, it started with net gurdies and salmon gurdies, what have you. But by the time it really got caught on to the rock cod fishery, some interesting gizmos were used to catch fish. In a burst of this is like the late 60s, early 70s. In a burst of creativity, fishermen used all kinds of weird hauling devices. One Santa Barbara boat sported a hydraulic-powered forward rear end that turned vertically with a skinny shiv on the top to pull rod cod lines. That'd be me. Craig Barbary, yeah, it was an affair to see. Craig Barbary, skipper of the Sunshine Lady, started with a geared bicycle-like pedal affair that he turned with his arms to pull lines through a stubby device resembling a mutant fishing pole. So I drive by Craig on the grounds, and then he had 3 guys lined up on the starboard rail, all going like this on bicycle pedals to bring their lines in. It was a crude affair, but it was really actually quite effective, but it was a funny looking setup. Boy, that's Other fishermen, like Phil Schenck, who hook and lined rock cod for years out of Santa Barbara beginning in the early 1980s, stuck with the rod and reel gear. And I think I have a quote from Phil here. Quote, "One of the good things about rod and reeling was that it was fast," said Schenck. "If you missed a spot or hit a spot where the fish weren't biting, you could get the gear back on the boat and be underway for a new spot more quickly than you could with buoy line gear." That's like set the whole pile of hooks down with a 40, 50-pound weight, buoy it off, you know, maybe put 2 or 3 of those in a spot if it was a little area of hard bottom, and then come back in 20 minutes and start hauling them. So it had the advantage over buoy line gear. If you set all that buoy line gear and they don't bite, it takes a long time to haul them back. If you're rod and reeling, you can get it. And these fishing with 50 hooks, rod and reeling, and like 15 or 10-pound sinkers. You get back. When I finally switched to buoy line, my right arm was an inch bigger than my left, and my shoulders weren't straight. It looked like all screwed up, like a boxer who passed his prime. So you can imagine rod and reeling that much and that often. So finally, I got a passage from the dive chapter, and I could have read more passages and taken up more time, but I have some pretty cool slides I want to show you that reflect some of what's in here, and I'm going to wrap a little maybe historical or even possible political thread through them. I'm prone to that, since I'm old enough that I don't care that much what people think about me. So this is a passage reflecting the hard hat commercial diving days. So initially, the first folks to take abalone and such in California were the Chinese, right? They were used, brutalized, and what have you on the railroads. And those that descended from those families or migrated from those families, many of them went to the coast to fish because they knew this from their homeland. It was something that came naturally to them. But they weren't divers. So they would stick poles down with what they called look boxes, which is really like my cheater reader glasses here, right? And they would look through the boxes, and the pole had a little blade on it. They'd pop the abalones off the rocks, and they'd take the abalone that way. Well, finally, ultimately, they got run off the grounds, and their place, there's a lot of racism in politics through the whole history of this period in American or past. They were replaced by the Japanese, who were divers. And they were the first ones to don woolen suits and dive into these frigid waters. This goes all the way up to the Farallon Islands, what I'm telling you right now, and into really, really cold water, and to dive for abalone. And then that in turn was finally replaced by the beginnings of the hard hat dive era in the 1950s. And that's, you know, air compressor, hard hat gear, big hose, tender on the boat, following the diver around as he's diving. And it was very successful, but it was dangerous. It was dangerous work too. Lad Hannibal's uncle, for example, died when his helmet came unexplainably detached. Then there was the time that a hard hat diver lost his air supply and quote-unquote drowned off Gaviota. We pulled him up and threw him in the truck and headed for town, Bob Benton explained. Since he was dead and all, flies buzzing around him and such, we figured it'd be okay to stop for a beer at the Las Cruces store. We met a doctor there who decided to take a look at the guy. Turns out he was alive after all. And he made a complete recovery. So that's this book, what I tried to do in this book was to, somehow, as just delicately as I could, and I'll admit it was a challenge, weave together history, the evolution of technology, and the stories of the people who were the heart, the grit of this whole wonderful industry that has gone through such a maturing process over the last century. Look, I'll tell you, and I'm biased, we have bad actors in every industry, every walk of life, and every profession. But these are the folks who put food on the table for average American families. And I have the deepest, deepest respect for these folks. In the introduction of the book, I think I hope to have captured my feelings about this industry that I was lucky enough to be a part of. But it's an honorable line of work. And the other flip side of that is, and I don't want to go all political or get all weepy, I'm joking. But these folks, I haven't met a fisherman who isn't a tried and true, dyed-in-the-wool environmentalist. Why do I say that, right? How could that be? These are the people who, I won't say, extract, utilize resources from the sea. It's because they fell in love with the sea, just like I did. And what they wanted to do was make a living out of the sea, and they figure they can feed people at the same time. What a wonderful combination. I've seen the biggest, toughest fishermen. I've seen Mike McCorkle with hands so big and fingers so swollen from net mending, a life of net mending, that he repeatedly asked me to pop the ring on a Pepsi can because he couldn't get his finger under it, right? I've seen him hold some little oodly-boodly thing that came out of his net, God knows what it was, and say, wow, Mick, look at that. It's got this little pincher over here and these little wiggly antenna. And watch him take that great paw of his and set it into the water and then see that little thing swim away. I mean, I've never, ever met in my days a commercial fisherman who would kill without reason, who would torture, who would catch fish intentionally that he didn't want to catch. Of course, there are unintended, captures. You've all read about bycatch and incidental catch and all of that. But essentially, these are all just folks like you and me. There's good ones, bad ones, all kinds. But their intentions, this profession is an extremely honorable one, and one that I know that I will always respect the interests and the dreams and desires of these people and their families. So enough of that. I've got some slides, some pretty cool ones, I think, to show you. If maybe Jerry will help me get rolling. These are fun. These are some of the images from the book. And hopefully, I can bring a little, there you go. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks. That's the advance button. Hopefully, I can bring a little embroidery to what I've described so far. So I'm going to briefly run through the 5 fisheries so we get a sense of what we're talking about. So nets. This is a typical bottom set gill net, right? Now, this isn't actually how it looks. This is a simpleton diagram. It looks basically like a tennis net, right? You've got anchors on the end, buoys on the top. But fishermen do all kinds of things to these nets. They'll lengthen these lines to put slack into the net, bunch it up for certain kinds of species. They'll bring it up off the bottom for other kinds of species and what have you. That's basically how a set gill net looks, though. That's a typical target catch of a set gill net. This is a halibut, a California halibut. That's actually Turk-Emersian on the right, a guy who was fairly famous in the fishery. He actually worked out of San Pedro, but God rest his soul, that's Turk on the right. He used to be a fire swallower in the circus and a sword swallower, but that's a whole other story. Great guy, Armenian guy. And this is from a set gill net. In 1990, a proposition was passed on the California ballot, Proposition 132, that pushed the gill nets 3 miles offshore on the coast and a mile off the islands. A vigorous debate about what was perception and what was reality. And the fishermen had a story to tell, you know, the very marine mammals they were being accused of harassing and, you know, and sometimes killing and what have you. Very hard to fish around those marine mammals too. The marine mammal population, the California sea lion population, when the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in 1972, there were 35,000 California sea lions on the entire Pacific coast. Somebody take a guess at how many there are now? 500,000. Yeah, they're swimming 100 miles up the Columbia River eating salmon. So, you know, I've come to the conclusion, after being around this for so many years, that we live in a democratic society. We elect politicians who appoint regulators, and if it's the values of society that are being advanced, in other words, that sea lions are more important than fish, that sea otters are more important than abalone, so be it. Those are the expressed values of the society we live in. This is just to demonstrate that that there are unintended consequences of all kinds of regulatory actions that are taken. What's fascinating about this is this looks like an anatomy class. Like all the meat's gone, right? But all the internal organs are in perfect shape. It's almost like you were in medical school. It's quite a trip. So this is a drift gill net. This is used primarily. It's used primarily for two things. Locally here, you'll see fishermen sometimes use drift gill nets for sea bass, but most prominently, it's used offshore to catch swordfish. What happens is a net up to a mile long is set in the sea, sometimes 100 miles offshore, even more, right? 3,000 to 6,000 feet. I think the limit is a mile. And what will happen is they drift, boat and net drift together through the seaway at night. And then in the morning, the boat will pull up the net. But actually, what's actually happening? They're pulling the boat up the net, right? You got little boat, giant heavy net. So when you turn on that winch, you're pulling yourself up the net. And if you're lucky enough, here's what you catch. So that's a big swordfish. I may be being misled by the size of its tail, which probably got chafed a little bit in the net. But my guess is this is probably a good 300-pound swordfish. You see they've already taken an opa right here. And this looks like it might have been a tuna or a small shark. But anyway, that's what offshore drift net fishing is like. And you can see the floats extending off the stern. They're still pulling the gear. So in the mid-1970s, drift net fishermen realized that they could catch Thresher Sharks, a lot of them in the Santa Barbara Channel. They had a big run in the 70s. This is probably a 400-pounder, 350, 400-pounder. That's my friend Andy Rasmussen on the Sundowner. And when they were constantly hunting new grounds for Thresher Sharks, get about $1.50 a pound. I love Thresher Sharks myself. It's a delicious eating fish. And then they started trying a little further offshore and a little further offshore. And then when they got outside Anacapa, one night, one of these fishermen was pulling back, hauling back, and guess what he caught? He caught a swordfish. And it didn't take long for the Thresher Shark drift netters to realize, wait a minute, $1.50 a pound Thresher Shark? $5 a pound swordfish. So they rearranged their gear, they rebuilt their gear. I think they increased the mesh size to 18 inches, if I'm not wrong. And they started going offshore targeting swordfish. That's why the harpoon fleet is drawn down to a small percentage of the swordfish production on the West Coast. Because there's a much more efficient way to catch swordfish. Harpooning, if you average a fish a day, you're doing fine. You come back with maybe a fish and a half a day. If you come back with 10 fish in a week, you had a good trip. These guys sometimes, if they're lucky, can catch 10 fish in a night. And by the way, the West Coast swordfish populations, by all estimates of every source, are in excellent health. For two reasons. Number one, they're very well regulated. Number two, the East Coast guys who have challenges in this regard got a 200-year head start on us. So we've learned lessons from their experience. But the bottom line is that's why harpooning is sort of faded out to mostly a yacht activity, nice tax write-off activity, or a pleasurable activity for a commercial fisherman who, a dentist, fireman, they tend to like harpooning because they get a bunch of time off and what have you, especially firefighters. So this is a classic example of the evolution of a fishery. How did the drift net swordfish fishery evolve? It evolved from thresher shark fishery. Trawling. Basically, trawlers are often called draggers, right? They make a living by towing nets close to the bottom. It's been controversial for decades and decades, the potential harm it does to the seafloor. But today's nets are designed, Mike McCorkle actually gets credit for designing what the California Fish and Game Commission called a light touch trawl gear for the folks that fish in the middle of the channel here for shrimp, sea cucumbers, and halibut. So basically it's towed along the bottom, and the fish either jump off, in the case of shrimp especially, jump off the seafloor into the net down into the cod end, right? And where they're captured and it's pulled in. These are called doors. So I don't want to get too complicated here, but the doors keep the net spread apart. These are big steel doors. And so the fish go into the cod end, and you haul in the net, and sort the animals, and there's your catch. And you remember when I talked to you? Well, there's Mike McCorkle right there. This guy's a legend. If I ever write another book, I might just write a book about Mike, period. He's been fishing commercially since 1954. He knows more about West Coast fisheries than any human being I've ever met. He has a monstrously encyclopedic vocabulary, and he's one of my best friends, always has been, always will be. This is a load of sea cucumbers, which he sells to a Chinese market in Santa Barbara. They're exported, they're dried to the likeness of a cat dropping, and then they're exported where they're chopped up and used in stews and soups and what have you. And the Chinese will tell you they are a powerful aphrodisiac. And so, in fact, Mike told me a story Tuesday night about when he sells his fish, his catch to the gentleman in Santa Barbara. Sometimes he sees him going off with a bag of sea cucumbers, and he says, "Well, what are you doing with a bag of sea cucumbers?" He goes, "Good for home. Good for home." So maybe he's right. Who knows? Maybe it's all up here. Maybe it's somewhere else. Ralph Hauser, okay, the man, the legend. This is the guy, I'm telling you. I have the good pleasure of working with his daughter, Susan Hazard, in Santa Barbara. And she continues to tell me wonderful stories about Ralph. One great one was when he was at his father's funeral in a suit, a tuxedo actually. And when returning from his father's funeral, he came back and decided he needed to saw a one-inch stainless steel shaft in half, right? For some purpose, right? So there he was in his suit, hacksaw just wailing away. Any of you who've done this kind of thing, it takes a while to saw through a one-inch stainless steel shaft. Somebody came by him and said, "Hey Ralph, you got the hacksaw blade in backwards." And he looked at him and said, "Yeah, I've always done it this way, it's all right." He also, when he started up his boat in the morning, there was a little fitting. He'd start up his boat and he'd go to engage the clutch on the hydraulics, so the hydraulic reservoir tank would now energize all the hydraulic lines for his trawl winch and what have you. There was a little grease fitting. Some folks call it a zerk fitting. It sticks out about that far, and it was right underneath. It was meant to grease, I believe, the wheel, the aft wheel that was there. Every morning he'd go and he'd turn that handle on to energize the hydraulic system. It'd take the same chunk out of the same knuckle every single day for an entire fishing career. He didn't give a crap. He could bandage it up and go fishing.
Before you change the picture, look at the milk crate and then look at the wood box next to it. They used to carry halibut and everything else with ice by themselves up the gangway planks with those things and stack them in the back of their truck at that age.
Yeah.
And those things were heavy.
No kidding. He's a tough customer, boy. God, I love this man. And I got the chance to interview him just before he passed. Within 6 months, I went up to his house, and his wife, Julie, who was my predecessor as the harbor master in Santa Barbara, would interpret and get into his ear and tell him the question. He would tell her the answer, and then she'd retranslate back to me what the answer was. So I had the great, good blessing to interview Ralph and get a pretty good, as much as I could, an oral history from him before he passed. Wonderful man. The Pink Mountain, right? 30,000 pounds of rock cod in one toe. And then the second person to ever walk on water. Standing on the cod end, some 20, 30 feet behind the boat. This is 30,000 pounds of rose rockfish. I cheated a little bit. This picture was taken up the line a ways, back from my journalism days when I went out on an at-sea story. Those are rose rockfish, and this picture was taken up by Carmel, but it's the exact same concept, same idea. I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to share it with folks. This picture's in the book, too. All these pictures are in the book. Purseine. What is a purseine? You ever wondered what the hell is a purseine? You see them all over the place here, right? The ones that go out and catch squid and sardines. It's almost as simple as it sounds. What they do is they set a net while the boat is underway, and the net, they set it in a big circle, and the net has heavy rings on the bottom and corks on top, right? And then some webbing so fish can't jump out. And then, I won't get into that, but anyway, and once they've made a complete circle, oftentimes with the assistance of a skiff that pulls the net around, and they secure it tight, there's a cable that runs through all these rings on the bottom of the net, right? And that's attached to a winch called appropriately a purse winch. And then they put it around that purse winch, and they start the winch going, and what happens? They purse the net. It closes up just like a purse, right? Then they've got this big, you know, like on the right, it looks like that when they pursed up, right? Now you can see they're drawing it up through a block and tackle on the boat. They bring the bag in smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until it's tight against the boat, right? And when it's tight against the boat, they begin brailing, or in the case of squid, pumping the catch into the fish hole. Brailing is just with a big scoop, usually with the assistance of a hydraulic boom. Example, sardines, up against the boat, ready to be, and I forget what these were pumped. I think it's a pump going down into them. It is. Being pumped aboard. So this is a purseine. This is the conclusion of a set on sardines. This is the business end, and this is how it's done. That makes sense? Stop me at any time if you have questions. Okay, trap fisheries. The golden bounty of Santa Barbara mainland and the Channel Islands. The spiny lobster. So in olden days, I think I mentioned, they used wooden lath traps to catch lobster. They worked really well actually, especially on virgin lobster populations. But they rotted out, they were tough to maintain, and as I said, you had to set them, a week or two early so they would cure and pressurize and get the air bubbles out of them. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is back in the heyday of, this is like late 40s, early 50s. I find this so astounding, this picture, for so many reasons. Notwithstanding the politically incorrect sign in the upper end right hand. But I would draw your attention to one thing. Somebody tell me, what's the most amazing thing about this?
The size of the
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Look at these. Besides these, look at the backs of these things.
Wow.
These are monstrous lobsters. I'd probably say 7 to 9 pound average lobsters. Huge lobsters. And this is when they were fishing on a virgin fishery. Now I'm going to take a little political diversion here. Digression. You can have lobsters this size when you're fishing on a virgin fishery. But you can't, it's absolutely impossible to have a virgin fishery and have seafood at the same time. Okay? Because if you want seafood, you need to continue fishing on this virgin fishery until it becomes a sustainable fishery. And it's through rules and regulations like escape ports for undersized lobsters and what have you, that you get to a sustainable fishery. There's just as many lobsters around now as there ever was, but they're usually what they now call market size, a pound to a pound and a quarter, the majority of them. And the markets actually love them because they're perfectly portioned for somebody to sit down and eat. Imagine if you sat down, somebody said, "Here's your lobster, Mr. Kronman. Enjoy. I'll see you in 7 pounds." That lobster there would cost probably $200 in a restaurant. So this is an old-timey thing, and it just tells so many. That's George V. Castagnola in the middle there, and it just tells a wonderful, wonderful tale. They're in their steamer. The steamer's right behind them. Wonderful stuff. Modern day.
That was State Street, right?
I believe it was, yeah. Yeah, lower, very lower end of State.
Yeah, where Yater's surfboards is now.
Right, same place. It's either there or Helena. I think it was State Street. It was State Street. My good friend, many of us know him, Chris Miller, the ever affable Chris Miller. Love the guy. He's one of my best buddies forever and ever. But having a political discussion with him, you better get ready for an intergalactic ride, because sometimes he's the son of an educator and an astrophysicist, I believe it is. And you can take a ride with Chris if you have a political discussion with him. I love the guy. And there he is with modern gear. The trap buoys are bullet-shaped, right? In the old days, they used to take a block of floatable wood, and I'm trying to remember if it was balsa, I think it might have been, and they bevel the end of it so that it would slough kelp. Well, the modern day version is the same thing, but it's bullet-shaped. So theoretically, kelp will slough off of the bullet end of it. And you can see the version of the modern day traps, and those are all dipped in a tar-like material that hardens, and they last a lot longer and fish a lot better. And again, it was Billy Ming and Rennie Yater who really invented, in our region, the wire lobster trap. Harpooning. Xiphias gladius. Xiphias gladius. I did not say it all. Known as the king to those who have fished him. The first swordfish I ever harpooned, I was very lucky, Santa Cruz Island, in the lee of the island, in an area that the veteran commercial fishermen call McCorkle Gardens. Give you an idea how many fish Mike's caught there. Caught 56 in a 7-day period fishing with Dick LaFawn once. But I was right there in that area, pretty much between radar towers and blue banks in the early afternoon. Coming down, saw this thing flipped out, my first swordfish, harpooned him, buttonholed him, got lucky. Dart came out right between his pectoral fins. And I was looking at him like a 6-year-old. I just couldn't believe it. It was about a 300-pound fish, too. It was not a small fish. And I looked at where the dart came out on his stomach, and right next to where my dart, because it goes sideways, it's designed that way, it toggles, right, on the fish. Right next to it, as if somebody had taken a scalpel or a rapidograph, was the exact outline of a swordfish dart. And I went, wait a minute. Couldn't have been this far from the spot that I plunged through him. So I rolled him slowly over, and I looked on his back, and right next to where my harpoon line was going through him, there was a chunk of scar tissue about this big. So this animal had been harpooned all the way through to here and swum hard enough to pull that dart all the way through his back. And it's a bronze dart about this big, and it's flared. Once it's in there, it's in there. To live again, to fin again. And from that moment on, I've had an indescribable reverence for this animal. This is the king of the sea, right here. Others will argue giant squid, and some will argue big mako or great white. For me, this is the king of the sea. And when you bring one aboard, it was fascinating. Their bills be all chiggered up and broken, and you just imagine these fights they're having at 2,000 fathoms, literally with giant squid. And they've taken beaks out of whales, and they're just a fascinating animal. Okay, I'm over my obsession. So this is what it's like to harpoon a swordfish, right? I can't look at this picture without channeling this. I mean, I guarantee you this is a dead swordfish. This is like, it's like the right angle, it's the right everything. This fish is flagging sky high, and it's about to get harpooned. But that's exactly what it looks like on the end of the plank. This is an old-timey plank. So this picture was probably taken in the 40s or 50s. It says in the book, I don't have it in front of me. But that fish, that's a dorsal fin and a tail fin. And you can drive around the ocean, you can see marlin, you can see sharks and marlins and sea lions with the fin up and what have you. There's nothing else on the ocean other than a swordfish that has that look, right? A black marlin comes close, and actually I almost harpooned one out here once till I realized it was a black marlin. But that is what gets your blood going. And you actually literally sometimes, if it's a scratchy season, you have to teach yourself to breathe when you're standing over one of those things. Because you fan that, there goes $1,000. But I was never lucky enough to catch more than 3 in a day. But during, I think, 78 was the big year. Some folks caught up to 15 fish a day with a big run of swordfish.
82.
Huh?
82.
82 was a big year?
Yeah, 78, 82.
I was fishing in 82. I only got about 20 fish. It took me a while.
82 was pretty good.
I was still learning. I was running with Tommy Lowe, following him around. And that guy had eyes like unbelievable. But anyway, olden times, they'd harpoon the swordfish and they'd put some poor schmuck, I shouldn't say that, this poor crew guy in a skiff and wait till the swordfish died, and he would haul them in by hand and sit there and wait for the mothership to come pick them up while the mothership went out looking for more swordfish. Now, can you imagine, and this is true, what happens when this fish gets hot? You thought he was dead. And you're in that little skiff with 100 fathoms of manila line tied to the tail of this probably looks like at least 225-pound swordfish, and he decides to take off. This is obviously taken from the mothership as they're approaching. And I think that's Bobby Reed's uncle, Urban, but I'm not positive. This is, that's Gloria Hepp, Fred's wife, with 2 swordfish they caught. They're fishing on the South Sea. You can see the harpoon line going in on the fish on the left. See the harpoon line going in right in his back?
Perfect shot, too.
Perfect shot. Yeah. Mr. Basking Shark. Wow. This is a whole other story. So in the 1950s, I'm sorry? There was a period of time in the 1950s where basking sharks were around. They haven't been so prevalent since. And their oil, their liver oil, is one of the most refined oils, natural oils on the planet. There's a passage in here you can read about, you can take a penny, toss it into a 50-gallon vat of basking shark liver oil, and you can watch it float all the way to the bottom and see it clear as day on the bottom of the 50 gallons. Extremely refined oil. But these things weigh tons apiece, so when you hit them with a harpoon, they actually used chain, and they kept it tied to the boat. They didn't buoy them off. These things would go berserk. So Manny Gorgita Sr., not Manny Gorgita Jr. or Manny Gorgita Jr., or actually there's 4 juniors, but anyway, Manny Gorgita Sr., I think he's living up in Grass Valley now. Wonderful guy. He was a contemporary of Red Allen and those guys. He and some buddies decided they were going to use blasting caps or use gunpowder and use explosive harpoons on these things. So they had the bright idea of going to construction sites and liberating dynamite from construction sites, right? And they couldn't understand when they were packing these heads of the harpoons why they get so jittery. It's the nitro, right, in the powder. And so they did that for a couple of trips and it worked okay. And then they hit one with the dynamite, and it went so berserk, its tail knocked the pulpit off the boat, and they all actually thought they were going to die, and they gave it up. These animals, the irony is they're very passive animals. That big mouth is not open to eat you. It's open to filter. It's baleen. It's open to filter. It's a filter feeder on the...
There was that cove on Santa Cruz Island that they used to have the rock quarry at. And on the right side there was a little cave and they stored dynamite in that.
Right.
And that's
Did they really?
That's where they got it from.
That's interesting. I'm trying to think where they quarried that rock from.
It was over by Tinker's.
Yeah, they quarried the rock by Fry's.
Yeah, that's right.
I never knew about that cove and the dynamite. That's pretty cool. Hooks, J-hook on the left, circle hook on the right. We've been using circle hooks since the Chumash days. They used to take like a square piece of abalone shell or a jagged piece, and they used chert drills, rock drills, and they'd start from the center, right, and slowly drill them out until they had a circle. How they figured out that a circle hook would keep a fish on better than a J-hook, to me, to this day, and I've used circle hooks, and I know they work really well. I still don't understand the physics of it. I'm sure Tim or somebody can explain to me how the hell it works, but I do know it works, especially ones with a little ring on them that can move around with a bone bag monofilament. I won't steal any more secrets. So a demersal long line. This is a long line that's set on the bottom. As you can see, it's usually stretched out over long areas of hard bottom, not where reefy rock structures are, but where good, solid, dependable hard bottom is. They stretch out for literally miles where they can, and that's basically the way they're organized. They have buoys along the here and there along the line, and they're weighted by anchors at various spots, and it lies right on the bottom. The alternative is buoy line fishing. I know this picture is familiar to one person in this room, and thank you for that. It was loaned to me for the purpose of this book and my presentations, and I'm deeply grateful for it. This is vertical rock cod fishing, buoy line fishing, where you set 100 hooks, even more sometimes. I used to use 50 at a time. If they were biting, I'd snap on another 50. And this was back in the suicidal days of a certain species that in a certain place that I won't give away any secrets here, but this shows you how successful buoy line fishing can be. I don't think there's a hook missing here. There might be a hook missing a fish, but you can see they go all the way out to the very end. The size of the sinker that these fish are floating, I want to guess is 30 pounds, in that range. So you can imagine how much flotation it takes to float a 30-pound sinker. And the long lines are also used inshore at times. As I was told by the individual who gave me this, that the long lines worked great and the blue mohawk wasn't absolute, was not absolute. But I want to go past that because you might figure out where that is. And for a short period of time in the 1980s, some experimental longline permits were issued up on the surface for targeting mako sharks. And in the wisdom of the Fish and Game Commission, the only people that were allowed to get experimental longline permits were people who had been illegally catching mako sharks in the few previous years. Because they had the demonstrated landings. So this is just fisheries management at its best. To screw any lottery idea or anything like that. We'll give it to the guys who know how to do it. Forget the fact that they were fishing illegally. That had too much identification in that picture. Here are the Chinese, pulling abalones off of the rocks. Here we are on the dive fishery. Here's Glenn Bickford in the hard hat gear. This was tough stuff. I mean, lead shoes, the whole deal. These guys, once they put the hat on, if the compressors weren't working perfectly, as you can tell from Mr. Jode in the background, I'm joking about that, but as you can tell from the guy in the background, this wasn't the most sophisticated fishery in the world at the time, and they would get mineral oil in their masks, the compressors weren't that dependable, the hose lines weren't that dependable, and the tenders weren't that dependable. And in the day, what they used to use is they had a feminine napkin seemed to be the wiping device of choice to clear their masks once they got up on the boat to clean their masks. But it was tough fishing, but the guys really loved it. They made a lot of money at it. This is a picture more recent from the 1980s when you could still take abalone. And you can see the kind of loads that people were taking. This was in the wetsuit era when they forewent. When the abalones were stacked up like hubcaps on every rock you came to at the islands or along the coast, that was when hard hat gear worked the best. You could walk along and you could pluck them off. It was easy. But as they thinned out a little bit, here we go with evolution again, that interfaced with the development of the wetsuit gear, where you could swim, the frogman deal. So you weren't limited to where I could clump from here to the door in a half an hour, and where you could swim great distances and you had a tender managing your hose and following you and cutting the kelp out of your way. Exhausting work for the tender. Sorry, I touched my mic there. And then in the 1990s, abalone are closed to any sport or commercial take now. And really the only assessment that can be made is the decline of the abalone population was probably a number of factors. Sport pressure, commercial pressure, and this was a disease that really hammered the abalone, I want to say in the late 1980s. I have to read back in my book. And it was called the withering foot disease. It was a kidney parasite which just destroyed the meat of the animal. They would fall off the rocks to the point where the sheephead wouldn't even eat them. And there's a healthy abalone on the right. And I don't know what the hell you'd call his belt buckle, but but this disease combined with fishing pressure are pretty much the accepted reasons for the decline of the fishery. A lot more red abalone coming back now. The debate continues with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife about opening a small experimental fishery in the Miracle Mile between Santa Rosa and San Miguel Islands. But most of the senior Fish and Wildlife staff don't have the time between now and when they're retired to really pursue and implement and the experimental fishery would obviously be like tag 3, take 1 kind of thing. Would have a strict total allowable catch. It's complicated fisheries management stuff. Nobody seems to have the will or the energy, and I'm happy to say that into the mic, on the record, to toy with an experimental abalone fishery at the islands these days. Plus, you can imagine what a political hotbed it would be. So today we have the Radden fleet. Don Radden builds boats in Santa Barbara. He initially built them for the abalone fleet, for day fishing, go fast boats, go to the islands, get your abalone, come back in one day. And now they're basically the heart of our sea urchin fleet. I believe we're the #1 sea urchin port on the West Coast. And here's a picture of unloading a couple sacks of sea urchin. They go down with a rake that has a sleeve that comes up on their arm, and they rake them. They put them in wire baskets. They lift them up. They put them in these cargo bags and lift them onto the boat and bring them ashore. You can see them under the hoist at Santa Barbara in fair weather times almost every day. And that concludes my presentation. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. And some of yours.